My mother stole my college fund while I was at my grandmother's funeral to pay for her stepson's education, but my grandmother left me the house in her will. So I packed their bags and kicked them out. Their reaction was, I remember the exact moment I realized I no longer mattered in my own family. It was a cold night, one of those where the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows like a warning. I was in the kitchen washing the last dishes from dinner. My mother, Isabel, was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone and smiling at something she was looking at. Mateo, my stepbrother, was sitting at the dining room table, twirling a pen between his fingers absently. Fernando, my mother's new husband, leaned back in his chair, slowly swirling a glass of whiskey, as if this house belonged more to him than to me. Mateo, Fernando said, his deep voice breaking the silence. Have you thought about which university you want to go to? Mateo smiled and set the pen down on the table. I'm still deciding. The University of Barcelona? Or maybe the University of Salamanca. But, it all depends on funding. My mother's face lit up. Oh, honey, we'll make sure you go wherever you want.
Don't you worry about that.
I stopped scrubbing the plate in my hand. I felt a knot in my stomach. Something in her tone didn't sit right with me. Fernando cleared his throat. In fact, Isabel and I were just talking about that. My mother set her phone down and turned to me, her expression unreadable. Alejandro, we need to talk. There it was, that sinking feeling I'd learned to ignore for years. It hit me again hard. I dried my hands on a towel, forcing my voice to sound calm. What's up? She hesitated for a moment. It's about your college fund. A chill ran down my spine. My father's college fund. The money he'd set aside for me before he passed away. The only thing he'd really left me. What about it? I asked, clenching the towel in my hands. Fernando exhaled, as if he were the one carrying the weight of this. Well, Alejandro, it's money that's just sitting there and used. And Mateo, well, he has a bright future ahead of him. We thought it would be logical to put it to good use. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence that only I seemed to notice. I let out a dry laugh. You're kidding, right? Mateo shifted uncomfortably, but didn't say anything. My mother crossed her arms. Alejandro, don't be dramatic. You're already in college, you're doing fine. Mateo needs it more than you do. I need it. It's mine. My voice started to tremble, the rage building faster than I could control it. Dad left that money for me. Not for Mateo. Not for anyone else. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. And I'm telling you, this isn't just about you, Alejandro. We're a family. We help each other. Fernando took a slow sip of his whiskey and looked at me as if I were a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. Look, son, I'm not your son, I snapped, clenching my fists. And you have no right to touch my father's money. Fernando let out a low chuckle and shook his head. You've got quite the temper, kid. My mother sighed heavily and rubbed her temples. Alejandro, you don't have to make this harder than it already is. Oh, I think you guys are doing a pretty good job of that. Finally, Mateo spoke. His voice was careful, measured. Look, Alejandro, if it's such a big deal for you, I don't need the money. But my mother shot him a look so sharp that he immediately closed his mouth. And it was in that moment that I understood. It wasn't Fernando's idea. It was hers. My own mother was willing to steal from me to provide for her new, perfect family. I felt something break inside me. I straightened, voice firm, serene. You're not touching my money.
Fernando snorted.
And what do you think you're going to do about it? I looked at my mother, searching her face for something. Regret, guilt, doubt, anything that would tell me she knew this was wrong. But she just stared back at me, unblinking. And that was my answer. I swallowed hard and pushed myself away from the counter, my jaw aching from how tightly I was clenching it. You know what? Take it. My mother's face softened slightly, as if she thought I was giving in. I shook my head.
Take it.
But don't expect to see me again. And with that, I walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind the family that had already left me long ago. I didn't go back to my room that night. I walked straight out of the house, feeling my breath form white clouds in the freezing air. My hands were clenched into fists, my heart pounding hard in my chest. I had nowhere to go, but anywhere was better than staying in that house. I ended up at my best friend Hugo's apartment. He didn't ask any questions when he opened the door. He just looked at me for a second and stepped aside to let me in. "Dude, what happened?" he asked finally, after I'd collapsed onto his couch. I let out a humorless laugh. "They're stealing my college fund. They're going to give it to Mateo." Hugo's jaw tightened. "You're kidding." I shook my head.
No.
Apparently, he has a bright future, and I don't need it. "Wow," Hugo murmured, running a hand through his hair. "Your mom? I mean, I knew she was terrible, but this is next-level betrayal." I didn't reply. I just sat there, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of everything sink into my chest. "So, what are you going to do?" he asked finally. I sighed. "I don't know, man. I told them if they took the money, they'd never see me again." Hugo snorted. "And you think they care?" That was the worst part. I wasn't sure. I didn't go home that night or the next. My mother didn't call. Fernando didn't either. The only message I received was from Mateo. "Mateo, hey, I didn't ask for this.
Just wanted you to know that."
I stared at the message for a long time before finally typing a reply. "Me, then don't take it." He never responded. A week passed. I slept on Hugo's couch. I went to my classes like nothing had happened. I tried to pretend my world hadn't imploded, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then, out of nowhere, my grandmother died. I found out through a curt text from my mother. "Mom, Grandma passed away this morning. The funeral is Saturday." That was it. "No, are you okay?" "No, I know you were close to her." Nothing. Just a cold, clinical message. I stared at the phone, feeling my stomach churn. My grandmother was the only person in my family who'd actually cared about me. She'd comforted me when my dad died, sent me birthday cards every year, saw through my mother's lies and manipulations. And now she was gone. I knew I had to go to the funeral. Not for my mother. Not for Fernando. Not for Mateo. For her. The day of the funeral was gray and bitterly cold. The sky was overcast, and the wind sliced at my face like blades. I stayed at the back of the church, watching as my mother pretended to be the grieving daughter, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Fernando stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. Mateo was there too, uncomfortable in his suit. I kept my distance. When the ceremony was over, we walked out to the cemetery. I shoved my hands in my coat pockets, my jaw clenched. I wasn't sure if I would say anything to my mother. But then I heard her talking. "I think it makes sense," she was saying quietly to Fernando. "The house is too big to just sit empty. We should move in." I stopped dead. She was talking about my grandmother's house. We hadn't even buried her yet, and she was already planning on taking everything that belonged to her. A bitter taste filled my mouth. I turned and walked away before I said something I might regret. But one thing was clear. If my mother thought she was going to get away with taking what didn't belong to her again, she was in for a rude awakening. I didn't go home after the funeral. I couldn't. But I didn't have to wait long for my mother to find me. She called the next day. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to talk about my grandmother. Straight to business. "Alejandro," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk about the house." I let out a dry laugh, gripping the phone tighter. "The house? You mean Grandma's house? The one she hasn't even been dead a week?" "Don't be dramatic," she snapped. "You knew this was going to happen. It doesn't make sense for the house to sit empty when we could." "We?" I interrupted. "Who's we?" She hesitated for a beat. "Fernando, Mateo, and I. We're planning on moving in." There it was. The final insult. I clenched my jaw. "That house isn't yours." There was a silence. Then she sighed, as if I were the irrational one. "Alejandro, we can work something out. It's too much for me to handle on my own." "You mean it's too much for you to accept that it's not yours for the taking?" Her voice hardened. "Don't start this, Alejandro. Your grandmother would have wanted the family to live in that house, not for it to go to waste." I almost laughed. Yeah, well, lucky for me, she left it to me. Silence. A long, stunned silence. What? I took a slow breath, savoring the moment. Grandma left me the house. Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You're lying. Oh yeah, I replied, enjoying how her confidence crumbled. Because I already talked to the lawyer this morning. The will is clear. The house is mine. And then she lost it. You ungrateful little, she spat, her mask cracking completely. After everything we've done for you. I laughed. Everything you've done for me? Like trying to steal my college fund? Like treating me like I don't exist?
No, Mom.
This time, you're not taking what's mine. Her breathing was ragged, furious. You can't do this. You wouldn't dare kick us out. I smiled. Who said I was kicking you out? I paused, letting the suspense hang in the air. You can stay. If you pay rent. The sound of her enraged breathing filled the line. You wouldn't. Try me? And for the first time in years, I was the one who hung up the phone. And it felt amazing. I didn't hear from her for 2 days. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. On the 3rd day, I got a call from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Then another. And another. Finally, my phone buzzed with a text. Mom, we need to talk. This isn't right, Alejandro. I ignored it. An hour later, a voicemail. Alejandro, you're being childish. We're your family. You can't just abandon us like this.
Call me.
I deleted it. Just when I was starting to relax, my phone rang again. This time it was Mateo. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. What do you want? He sighed. Look, man, I didn't ask for any of this. I just don't want things to get any worse. I almost laughed. Worse? You really think they can get any worse, Mateo? He hesitated. I know Mom messed up badly. Okay? And Fernando, well, I know he's selfish. But this rent thing, you're not serious, are you? I leaned back, gripping the phone tighter. Oh, I'm dead serious. Mateo let out a long sigh. Come on, Alejandro. You're not like this. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not proving anything, I replied coldly. I'm setting boundaries. Something none of you have ever respected. There was a long silence. Then his voice dropped. You know she's not going to let this go, right? I closed my eyes. I knew. And I was ready for it. I knew this wasn't over. My mother never backed down when she wanted something. And now she wanted the house. The next day, I was at work when my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't her. It was another unknown number. I ignored it. The silence in the house was different. Now it wasn't the usual indifference I had grown up with. It was something thick, charged, full of barely contained resentment. For the first time, my mother, Fernando, and Mateo realized I wasn't going to back down. And they hated it. At first they tried to ignore me. For days, no one spoke to me unless absolutely necessary. My mother avoided crossing paths with me in the kitchen. Fernando shut himself away in his office. And Mateo, well, he just kept his head down.
Perfect for me.
But then the little annoyances started. The Wi-Fi would suddenly stop working. Someone turned the heat down to near freezing at night. And my favorite, the clothes I'd left in the washing machine appeared dumped on the basement floor, still damp. Pathetic. Predictable. Laughable. I didn't react. And that infuriated them even more. One night, about a week after the confrontation, I came home late from work to find Mateo sitting on the porch steps. He looked up as I approached, rubbing his hands together against the cold. What do you want? I asked, pulling out my keys to unlock the door.
He sighed.
Can we talk? I hesitated for a beat, but then I went inside, leaving the door open behind me. He followed. We sat at the kitchen table. Mateo looked down, studying his hands. This whole thing is a mess, man. I raised an eyebrow. For you? Or for Mom and Fernando?
He sighed.
For everyone. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. If you're here to convince me to back down, don't waste your breath. He shook his head. It's not that. Just, he hesitated. I don't know, Alejandro. I didn't ask for any of this. And yet you benefited from it. Mateo winced. I didn't know they were planning on taking your college fund. I swear. I watched him for a moment. I wanted to believe him. Maybe a part of me even did. But it didn't change anything. You still took it. He looked away. I didn't have a choice. I let out a dry laugh. That's a lie, and you know it. Mateo exhaled forcefully. I didn't want to be the favorite, Alejandro. I didn't want any of this. I tilted my head. Did you ever tell them that? He stayed silent. And that was all the answer I needed. Finally, he spoke again. You're really going to make them pay rent? I nodded. Yes. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. They're losing their minds over this. I smiled thinly.
Good.
Mateo looked up. His expression was different. Respect, maybe? Regret? I don't know. I don't know how you put up with them for so long. I sighed. Me neither. For the first time in years, we just sat in silence. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't tense. Just two people trapped in the same toxic family, finally seeing it for what it really was. Mateo exhaled. I should go. I nodded. Yeah. He hesitated at the door. I'm sorry, Alejandro. I didn't reply. And then he was gone. The next morning, my mother exploded. I was making coffee when she stormed into the kitchen, throwing a folder down on the counter. This is insane. Her voice was sharp, furious. Charging your own mother rent? Do you even hear yourself? I took a sip of my coffee, completely unfazed. I hear myself perfectly. She stabbed a finger at the papers. We can't afford this. I raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? Then tell me how you were planning on affording this house if you'd won. She clenched her jaw. That's different. I smiled coldly.
No.
Actually, it's not. She let out a shaky breath, then changed tack. Alejandro, we're family. We're supposed to take care of each other. I tilted my head. Like you took care of me? She flinched. It's not the same. I leaned forward. It's exactly the same. You never cared when I was the one suffering. But now that you're the one paying the price, suddenly it's unfair. She stared at me, her lips pressed together. And then she did what she always did when she had no way out. She played the victim. I don't understand where I went wrong with you. Her voice cracked, laden with false emotion. I raised you, but I didn't buy it anymore. You have two options, I said, my voice serene. You pay the rent or you move out. But you are never taking anything from me again. She let out a bitter laugh and shook her head. You're going to regret this, Alejandro. I took another sip of my coffee.
No.
I won't. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. The first rent payment was due on the 1st of the month. By the time the 31st rolled around, I knew they weren't going to pay. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone when I heard my mother's voice behind me. Alejandro. I didn't look up. If you're coming to beg for an extension, don't even bother. She exhaled forcefully. I just need more time. I finally looked at her. You had time. You just didn't think I'd follow through. She pressed her lips into a thin line. You're really going to make your own family homeless over a stupid grudge? I smiled mockingly. I'm just making my tenants pay rent. If you can't afford to live here, you move out. That's how the real world works. Her eyes flashed with fury, but she held back. Fernando and I are trying to find a solution. We just need a little flexibility. I leaned back on the couch. Fernando's driving a new car. You go to the salon every month. You had money when you thought this house was going to be free. She swallowed hard. This isn't fair. Oh no. I tilted my head. Did it seem fair when you tried to steal my college fund? Silence. I stood up and walked past her. You have 24 hours. The next morning, I woke to the sound of suitcases being dragged down the stairs. I didn't even bother to check. I just sat at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee. The first one to appear was Fernando, his face red with frustration. You've really outdone yourself, kid. I smiled over my mug. And yet, the house is still mine. He clenched his jaw. You're going to regret this. I took another slow sip. I doubt it. He muttered something under his breath and walked out. Next was Mateo, carrying his backpack. He paused at the door, hesitating. I guess this is it. I nodded. I guess so.
He sighed.
You know, I don't blame you. I raised an eyebrow. He gave a sad smile. But I wish things had been different. I shrugged. Me too. And then he left. The last to remain was my mother. She stood in the doorway, looking at me. I hope you're happy, she said, her voice cold. You destroyed this family. I held her gaze.
No, Mom.
You did. She swallowed hard, her face twisted between anger and something else. Something that almost looked like regret. But I didn't care anymore. I watched her pick up her purse and walk out without another word. The house was finally silent. Not the uncomfortable silence I'd grown up with. Not the forced civility of people barely tolerating each other. Just peace. I exhaled slowly, letting the full weight of the situation sink in. For the first time in my life, I was free.